The farmers thought they won. The tractors rolled home. The tear gas cleared. France said no. Italy said no. Poland said no. And the deal, the biggest free trade agreement in human history, was supposed to be dead. But then something happened that almost nobody saw coming. Ursula von der Leyen flew to Montevideo, stood on a stage in Uruguay, and signed the Mercosur deal anyway, without a full council vote, without the blocking country's approval, without asking for permission. Just like that, 25 years of negotiations, 720 million people, trillions of euros in trade, and the future of European farming were decided by one woman in one room, thousands of miles away from Brussels. And now, Europe is asking one very dangerous question. Did the president of the European Commission just stage a coup? Let's go back to where this story really begins, because to understand what Ursula von der Leyen just did, you need to understand what the Mercosur deal actually is, why it terrifies half of Europe, and why the other half is desperate to make it happen no matter the cost. Mercosur is a South American trading bloc. It was created in 1991, and today it includes Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia. Combined, these 5 countries cover nearly 15 million square kilometers. That's almost double the size of the entire European Union. They sit on some of the most fertile land on the planet: the Amazon basin, the pampas of Argentina, the savannas of Brazil. These are places where a single farm can be bigger than a European country, where cattle graze on land so vast it doesn't even need fencing, where soybeans grow in volumes that make European harvests look like a backyard garden. The EU-Mercosur trade deal was first proposed in 1999. That's not a typo, 1999, the year before the Sydney Olympics, the year people were panicking about Y2K. For 25 years, negotiators flew back and forth across the Atlantic, held thousands of meetings, produced thousands of pages of legal text, and still couldn't close it. Why? Because the moment they got close, someone in Europe panicked. And that someone was almost always a farmer. Here's the core of the deal. Europe would cut tariffs on South American agricultural goods: beef, poultry, sugar, rice, soybeans, honey, orange juice. In return, South America would lower its tariffs on European exports: cars, machinery, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, wine, and spirits. On paper, it reads like a textbook example of free trade working exactly as intended. Everybody sells what they're best at producing. Everybody gets cheaper access to what they need. Everybody wins. Except European farmers don't see it that way. And their argument isn't just emotion, it's math. A Brazilian cattle farmer operates under a completely different set of rules than a French one. In France, a farmer raising beef cattle has to comply with strict EU animal welfare regulations, strict environmental rules, strict limits on antibiotics and hormones, strict documentation requirements, strict land use policies. All of that compliance costs money, real money. It raises the cost of every kilogram of beef that leaves a French farm. Now take a Brazilian farmer. Fewer regulations, lower labor costs, cheaper land, warmer climate that reduces energy costs, vast economies of scale. That Brazilian farmer can produce a kilogram of beef at a fraction of the cost of the French farmer. And under the Mercosur deal, that cheaper beef would now flow into the European market with significantly reduced tariffs. The French farmer isn't losing a fair competition, he's losing a rigged one. And it's not just beef. European sugar farmers face the same threat from Brazilian sugar. European poultry farmers face the same threat from Brazilian chicken. European soy farmers face the same threat from Argentine soybeans. Sector after sector, the story was identical. South American producers with lower costs, fewer restrictions, and massive scale would flood the European market with cheap products. And European farmers, already struggling with rising input costs and shrinking margins, would simply be wiped out. France understood this better than anyone. French agriculture is not just an industry, it is a national identity. France has more protected geographical food designations than almost any country on earth. Champagne, Roquefort, Brie, Bordeaux. French food is French culture. And French farmers vote. They protest. They shut down highways with tractors. They dump manure outside government buildings. They have done it before, and they will do it again. So when Brussels started pushing Mercosur hard in late 2024, France didn't just object, it organized. Italy followed. And Italy's objection wasn't just about agriculture. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had broader concerns about the deal's enforcement mechanisms. She wanted guarantees that South American countries would actually uphold the environmental and labor commitments written into the agreement. Because here's the thing about trade deals. They are only as strong as their enforcement. You can write the most beautiful climate protections into a treaty, but if there's no real mechanism to punish violations, those protections are just words on paper. And Meloni, whatever you think of her politics, was asking a legitimate question. What happens when Brazil clears another 1 million hectares of Amazon rainforest the day after signing? What happens when Argentina's labor standards slip? Who enforces it? How? And what's the actual penalty? Poland and Hungary raised their own objections. Austria was against it. The Netherlands was conflicted, caught between its massive agricultural export industry and its port economy that desperately wanted the new trade flows. Even within Germany, which was one of the deal's strongest supporters, there were fractures. German car manufacturers wanted the deal signed yesterday. German farmers wanted it buried. By the time the EU summit in December 2024 rolled around, it was clear that von der Leyen did not have the votes. The qualified majority she needed, meaning at least 15 of the 27 EU member states, representing at least 65% of the EU's total population, was simply not there. France, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Austria. The blocking coalition was real, it was organized, and it was loud. So the deal should have died in Brussels, or at least been put on life support until the political climate changed. That would have been the normal, expected democratic response to a clear lack of consensus among the member states that the European Commission is supposed to serve. But Ursula von der Leyen didn't do the normal thing. She didn't do the expected thing. She got on a plane. And what she did next didn't just shock European farmers. It shocked constitutional lawyers, political scientists, and heads of government across the entire continent. Because what she did raised a question that Europe had never seriously had to ask before. How much power does the president of the European Commission actually have? And is there anyone who can stop her from using it? Montevideo is not Brussels. It doesn't have the cold, gray, bureaucratic weight of the EU quarter. It sits on the southern edge of South America, where the Rio de la Plata meets the Atlantic, a quiet, relatively small capital city that most Europeans couldn't find on a map. But on December 6, 2024, Montevideo became the most politically explosive city on the planet, because that is where Ursula von der Leyen chose to land. That is where she chose to stand on a stage. And that is where she chose to announce, with a smile, that the EU-Mercosur deal was done. The reaction in Europe was instant, and it was volcanic. To understand why, you need to understand how the European Commission is supposed to work. The Commission is not a government. It is not elected directly by European citizens. Ursula von der Leyen herself was not voted into office by ordinary people. She was nominated by EU member state governments and then approved by the European Parliament. Her entire mandate, her entire legitimacy rests on the idea that she acts within the boundaries set by the member states and the Parliament. She is supposed to be their servant, their executor, the person who carries out the collective decisions of Europe's democratic institutions. She is not supposed to be the person who makes those decisions herself when the democratic institutions are moving too slowly for her liking. But that is exactly what critics accused her of doing in Montevideo. France, Italy, Poland, Austria, and Hungary had all made their opposition crystal clear. The blocking coalition existed, the votes were not there. And yet, the deal was signed. So how? How did she do it? The answer lies buried deep inside the legal architecture of the European Union itself. And it is complicated enough that even many European politicians didn't fully understand it until this moment. The EU-Mercosur agreement is not a single document. It is structured as a mixed agreement, meaning it covers both areas where the EU has exclusive competence, things like trade in goods and tariffs, and areas where member states retain their own sovereign competence, things like investment protection and certain services. For the parts that fall under exclusive EU competence, the European Commission has the legal authority to act on behalf of all member states. And von der Leyen's argument, the argument her legal team constructed, was that she could provisionally apply at least the trade portions of the agreement without waiting for unanimous ratification from all 27 member states. This is technically defensible. Legal scholars will argue about it for years. But technical defensibility is not the same as political legitimacy. And politically, what von der Leyen did felt to many Europeans like a betrayal, like a woman who had been told no by the people she was supposed to answer to, and had found a legal loophole to say yes anyway. French Prime Minister Michel Barnier called it unacceptable. He didn't use diplomatic language. He didn't soften it. He said France had been clear. The deal was not acceptable in its current form, and that signing it without consensus was a violation of the trust between the Commission and its member states. The French Agricultural Union, the FNSEA, which had organized many of the tractor protests in Brussels just weeks earlier, immediately announced new protests. This time, the anger wasn't just about the deal itself. It was about the process, about being ignored, about watching a single unelected official override the objections of elected governments representing hundreds of millions of people. Italy's Giorgia Meloni was equally sharp. She had spent weeks raising legitimate questions about enforcement mechanisms, about environmental protections, about what the deal actually meant for Italian farmers and Italian industries. Those questions had not been answered. They had been bypassed. And Meloni made clear that Italy would challenge the legal basis of the signing, that Rome was already consulting its legal teams, and that this was far from over. The European Parliament, which still needs to ratify the full agreement before it can enter into force permanently, erupted into competing factions. Supporters of the deal argued that von der Leyen had done what needed to be done, that 25 years of negotiations could not be held hostage forever by a minority of blocking states, and that the economic logic of the deal was simply too strong to abandon. Opponents called for an emergency session. Some called for a vote of no confidence against the Commission president herself. The word being whispered in the corridors of the Parliament building in Strasbourg was accountability. And behind that word was a harder, sharper one: overreach. Because here is the thing that made this moment genuinely unprecedented. It wasn't just that von der Leyen had pushed through a controversial trade deal. Leaders push through controversial decisions all the time. What made this different was the scale of the opposition she had overridden and the method she had used to do it. She hadn't persuaded the blocking countries. She hadn't called an emergency summit. She hadn't negotiated new side agreements to bring France and Italy on board. She had simply found a legal mechanism that allowed her to act without them. And in doing so, she had exposed something deeply uncomfortable about the European Union's institutional structure: that the president of the Commission, if she is willing to be aggressive enough about her legal authority, can move faster and further than the democratic bodies around her can react. That is not a small thing. That is a constitutional crisis dressed in the language of trade policy. The deal was signed. The political storm was raging. But underneath all the fury, underneath all the legal arguments and parliamentary uproar, there was still one question that actually mattered to ordinary Europeans. What does this agreement mean in practice? What changes? Who wins? Who loses? And was everything the farmers feared actually written into the final text? The answer is complicated, and that complexity is itself part of the problem. On the European side, the deal opens South American markets to goods that European industries have been trying to sell for decades. German car manufacturers get lower tariffs on vehicles exported to Brazil and Argentina, markets where European cars currently face import duties as high as 35%. European pharmaceutical companies get better intellectual property protections. European wine and spirits producers get access to a continent of 270 million consumers with a growing middle class and an appetite for premium imports. For Germany, for Spain, for the Nordic countries, this deal represents billions of euros in new export opportunities. The economic case is genuinely strong, but for European farmers, the numbers cut the other way. Under the agreement, the EU would allow 99,000 tons of Brazilian and Argentine beef into the European market at a reduced tariff rate, 180,000 tons of poultry, 180,000 tons of sugar, large volumes of rice, honey, and soybeans. These are not symbolic quantities. These are volumes large enough to move markets, large enough to push prices down, large enough to squeeze margins for farmers who are already operating on the edge. And the core grievance remains unresolved. South American producers operate under different environmental and labor rules. The so-called mirror clauses written into the deal, the provisions that were supposed to ensure South American exporters meet equivalent standards, are widely considered by agricultural experts to be too weak and too difficult to enforce in practice. France's agricultural unions did their own analysis of the enforcement mechanisms and concluded that there was no realistic pathway to penalizing violations quickly enough to protect European farmers from the immediate market impact of cheaper imports. By the time a formal dispute mechanism was triggered, investigated, and resolved, the damage to European farming communities would already be done. Entire sectors could collapse before the legal process even reached a conclusion. That is not a hypothetical fear. That is a structural flaw in the agreement that supporters of the deal have never convincingly answered. And then there is the environmental dimension, which may be the most consequential part of this entire story. Brazil's Amazon rainforest is not just a Brazilian resource, it is a planetary one. It absorbs carbon. It regulates rainfall patterns across South America and beyond. It is home to biodiversity that science hasn't even fully cataloged yet. And Brazilian agricultural expansion, the very expansion that makes Brazilian beef and soy so cheap to produce, has been one of the primary drivers of Amazon deforestation for decades. The deal includes commitments from Brazil to uphold the Paris Climate Agreement and to protect forests. But environmental groups across Europe have analyzed those commitments and reached a near unanimous verdict. They are not enforceable in any meaningful way. They are political cover, not genuine protection. So what Europe has ended up with is a deal that delivers real, measurable, immediate benefits to its industrial exporters and real, measurable, immediate risks to its farmers and its environmental commitments, with enforcement mechanisms that are theoretical at best and decorative at worst. Von der Leyen calls it a generational opportunity. Her critics call it a generational mistake. And the continent that will have to live with the consequences is still bitterly, dangerously divided over which one of them is right. The tractors may have left Brussels, but they will be back. And next time, they won't just be protesting a deal. They will be protesting a system that signed it over their heads without their consent and without a convincing answer to the question that started this entire crisis 25 years ago. Who does European trade policy actually serve?